Hello and welcome to Rockanory. I'm Zoë Howe and today I'm going to be reading from this British Beat Explosion Rock and Roll Island, and this is a collection of essays that was published this year by Aurora Metro. I contributed a couple of chapters to it, don't let that put you off, but it's a celebration of Eel Pie Island and its rock and roll legacy, particularly focusing on the 50s and 60s. And its role within the British Beat Explosion, hence the title. I don't know if you know much about Eel Pie Island, but it's a fascinating place, and it's quite strange because obviously back in the day it had quite a reputation. Lots of amazing gigs there, early gigs by the Stones, the Yardbirds, Long John Baldry, you name it, they played there. Now it's an incredibly tranquil little place. It's just a funny little island in the Thames near Twickenham, and you would never know if you weren't already aware of its history, how noisy it must have been, because I went past there the other night and it was all dark and it was very, very quiet and there was nobody around and it was silent. And I thought, you don't fool me. I know your secrets and they're noisy ones, so yeah, it's a funny old place. So we're trying to unlock the secret and get people to learn a bit more about it with the Eel Pie Island Music Project, which is this book. There was also a fantastic exhibition this year curated by Michelle Whitby, who also contributed to this book, and also a film called Rock and Roll Island, which I believe will be coming out next year. So it's Eel Pie-tastic. So I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction, sort of the middle of an introduction, and I hope you enjoy it. If you don't, then please don't let me know, because I'm very sensitive. Liverpool's Merseybeat movement is perhaps the example that immediately springs to mind when the subject of British beat music is raised, followed by the names of late-night hubs such as the iconic Marquee in London's Soho or Liverpool's Cavern. Excuse me. But while Eel Pie Island's place within the legacy of the beat explosion is rather less vaunted, it shouldn't be underestimated in its importance for fostering and nurturing the scene and its many admirers in a unique and unforgettable way. But before R&B and rock and roll really gripped the Brits, trad jazz had these sceptred isles in something of a fever. It provided a whirling maelstrom of jubilant sound, wilder and more free than much of the staid and sanitised pop of the time that seemed better suited to entertaining children than being the background to a young adult trying to get their rocks off. Lita Rose's How Much Is That Doggy in the Window was a huge hit, say no more. Smooth crooners like Sinatra and Perry Como also dominated the charts, and no disrespect to the gentler moments of old Blue Eyes and co, you couldn't tear at your clothes, shake your hair loose and stamp yourself into a frenzy to catch a falling star. If it wasn't for Gene Vincent or the raunchy sound of black American voices belonging to the likes of Little Richard, Etta James and Ray Charles, or those who loved black American music such as Elvis Presley, well, it doesn't bear thinking about. Fortunately, in 50s Britain, trad jazz bridged the gap and, crucially, introduced the blues. One of the earliest trad jazz clubs was started by the clarinetist Cyril Laurie, a musician whose band would frequently play Eel Pie Island, and who claimed to be the reincarnation of fellow clarinet player Johnny Dodds, even though Dodds was still alive when Cyril was well into his teens. We needn't go into that now. Cyril's club was based in Ham Yard, Soho, a cul-de-sac that was home to a boxing gym, and it was where the street traders from the market on Rupert Street could store their barrows. You had a few culture clashes going on there, literally in some cases. The club was famed for its all-nighters and general atmosphere of licentious sexual energy. In fact, it wasn't unusual to hear of gig-goers claiming to have had rampant sex under the stage while the band was playing. Jazz and rock and roll clubs, coffee bars, dance halls, they all attracted music-mad thrill-seekers, musicians, and of course, horny American soldiers, who were key to this scene, not only for bringing records from back home, but these snake-hipped GIs also brought dance steps from across the ocean. Swing dancing and lindy hopping, of course, came over during the war, but later moves like the twist, the sugar push and the alligator were the dances that slowly replaced skip jiving in youth clubs and venues across the country, before taking off properly in the early 60s. However, in the early 50s, the teenager, supposedly a phenomenon that burst into unruly life with the advent of rock and roll, was already sneaking out to jive and sink a few beers and make whoopee if they were lucky enough to live near even the most makeshift live music venue. Acker Bilk, whose bowler hat was said to reside by the bar at the Eel Pie Jazz Club, Ken Collier, Chris Barber, with key Eel Pie figures Alexis Corner and Cyril Davis in his group, George Melly, these were the stars who were getting everyone on their feet. Far be it for jazz lovers in the 50s to sit and stroke their chins thoughtfully to the music. They were dancing so hard their shoes would be destroyed, the floors were in jeopardy, especially if, as with the already dilapidated Eel Pie Hotel's jazz club, the broiling Thames was underneath the rotting boards. The air hummed with tobacco and hormones, and the walls were slick with sweat. George Melly described the method of dancing to trad as anti-dancing. Jump heavily from foot to foot like a performing bear, he instructed, preferably out of time to the beat. Trad musicians have christened these self-made elephants leapnicks. It would be these leapnicks who would joyously pound the sprung ballroom floor at Eel Pie Jazz Club, encouraged by club promoter Arthur Chisnell. Anyone who thinks jazz lovers are a civilised, even dull and stuffy bunch evidently needs to do their research. This lot were fabulously balmy, and as so many ex-beatniks insist, drugs weren't really needed. They had ale, music, sex, a dance floor. Oh, my cat's just come in. Hello. Where was I? Arthur Chisnell has long been hailed for his contribution to youth work, for providing a safe place for the young people of West London to wig out on a few beers, vibrant energy, and the most cutting-edge sounds around. The dance floor was like a trampoline, says Eel Pie Islander Trevor Bayliss. Everyone would be dancing, screaming, laughing and jumping around. They were great times. Nothing shocked us back then. Well-travelled musicians crossed the river by ferry to get to odd little Eel Pie Island, also known as Eel Pie Land. Mock passports were issued to enter this strange and mystical land, and there they found a place that boasted an atmosphere comparable with that of New Orleans. They revelled in the enthusiasm of the audience, some members of which would express their enthusiasm in all sorts of acceptable ways. It was very difficult not to get laid on Eel Pie Island, as George Melly once said. Sex rose from the dancing crowd of young beatniks like steam from a kettle. Many beat groups, of course, the Beatles being an obvious example, graduated from skiffle and a love of Glasgow-born skiffle king Lonnie Donegan to rhythm and blues. The route from trad to beat is not hard to trace. UK jazz musicians were already well versed in the blues, barrel house and boogie-woogie, no doubt having heard first-hand in many cases the voice of Bessie Smith or the joyous stride piano of Fats Waller. Skiffle, meanwhile, was like the punk of the 50s. It rammed a much-needed shot of energy into the backside of the establishment, to many people's outrage, and it boasted something of a DIY ethic. Tea-chest basses with bits of string, washboards, kazoos. It had never been so easy to make music. Skifflers were, as writer John Savage puts it, the younger siblings of the trad jazzers who'd packed out the 100 Club on Oxford Street and clubs like Eel Pie Jazz Club, playing to duffel-coated weirdy-beardies and their black-tighted, coal-eyed girlfriends. Songs such as Humphrey Littleton's Bad Penny Blues bridged the trad-skiffle gap. I'm going to leave it there, but that was from the British Beat Explosion Rock and Roll Island. It's full of really good stories, and it's quite a slim volume, but there's lots of really interesting contributions, including one from Don Crane from the Downliners sect, I do believe, is in here. And as I say, Gina Way, who runs the Eel Pie Club today, and lots of other interesting bits and pieces in there too, and some great pictures. So get yourself a copy. It's published by Aurora Metro. Look out for the film Rock and Roll Island, and thank you as always for tuning in and giving me your time and listening and watching, and don't forget that there are lots of other videos on this channel, the Rockanory channel, so if you like having rock and roll bedtime stories read to you, then you are in the right place. So knock yourselves out, not literally, and see you soon.